And I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session this afternoon with a distinguished panel to talk about this actually hugely controversial topic. I mean, regeneration and gentrification, how to regenerate without simply pushing out the poor people. It's something The Guardian has written an awful lot about over the years, so a particular interest in this. And it is a topic, of course, that is being debated around the world. This is not peculiar in any way to bits of London or to bits of the UK, but it does always quite literally come close to home for so many people. The huge row that we saw over Haringey's development vehicle with Lend-Lease, for example, resulted in the resignation of Council Leader Claire Cober. I mean, amid a furious row, basically. That's just one, a recent high-profile example. A recent report in Manchester accused Manchester of becoming a city that is not meeting the demands of most of its citizens and families on lower incomes because the building boom has left them out in the cold. So we are going to go straight in to our debate, and I'm delighted to have a fantastic panel here with me to debate this topic, and we will of course also be opening up to yourselves. So we have Sinead, Sinead Butters, who is Chief Executive of Staffordshire-based Aspire Housing since 2006, Chair of the Place Shapers National Network of over 100 community-based housing associations, and more importantly and pertinently for this, one of the Great Places Commissioners, which you'll be telling us a bit more about, won't you, Sinead? We've got Hugh Lewis, who is Managing Director of Bexley, which is the wholly owned development company created last year by the London Borough of Bexley. Yeah. Hugh's got more than 25 years' experience as a leader and joined Bexley from a post as Managing Director of the Urban Growth Company, and his task is to run a 12-year plan for the borough, including the creation of 2,500 quality homes. So we'll be talking about that. We've got Tom Bloxham, Chair and co-founder of Urban Splash, huge amount of experience in regeneration ever since the 1990s, I think, possibly before, when his company first began developing trendy loft apartments in former industrial buildings. And last but by no means least, we've got Marvin Rees, of course, elected elected Mayor of Bristol in May 2016. Spent most of the past 2 years, I think it's fair to say, battling with some fairly brutal spending cuts, but has indeed pledged to deliver 2,000 new homes by 2020 and to keep the city's largest regeneration scheme, Hengrove Park, on track. So let's dive straight in. Tom, let's come to you first and talk about, if you could, just briefly about some of the schemes that you've been involved in. We've set up this question as regeneration or gentrification. Actually, quite a lot of the time it isn't either or, is it? I mean, what's your view?
The implication is that gentrification is bad and regeneration is good. And I think that's an implication which is widely held, but it shows a certain southern bias, in my view, or at least a rich area bias. And the sort of schemes that Urban Splash have been involved in is schemes like Park Hill in Sheffield, the Old Cardinal Estate in New Islington, Manningham Mills in Bradford, Jimmy Hop Park in Langworthy. In all those examples, actually there was no demand for houses, very few people living there. Half the even social housing was empty, and the houses available on the private market were selling for 10 or 12 grand to the worst sort of landlords in the back of pubs, being unmortgageable. And actually our job has been to change the perception of those places and bring back life and vitality and bring back different people with them. I think we absolutely need to respect the people who are already living there, and I think there are a number of simple things you can do to ensure that actually it is regeneration rather than simply gentrification. The first thing is a right to return, that if people are already living there, they've got a right to return, and we've done it on exactly the same terms, but in brand new homes, often which they've designed themselves. I also think in invisibility and multi-tenure, so in the same estate, in the same building even, have different people with different tenures in the same building, which our experience is it works really well. The third thing is a real emphasis on placemaking, as Lord Heseltine was saying before, on making amazing places, and actually making places where everybody wants to live, the existing residents as well as new residents. Then there's a mix of uses, and actually we've done things like put artist studios and schemes, sponsor free schools which are Ofsted outstanding, put in marinas, put in new public parks, put in all sorts of facilities. The fifth thing I would plead for is modular housing. And the reason I would plead for modular housing is what I'm really passionate about is making really great design as cheap as possible, not as expensive as possible. And if we're going to do that, And if we're going to change things, we've got to have a real think about what's going to happen. And you can look at most of the products. I'm looking for my phone in my pocket, which is somewhere. You look at your mobile phone. The first mobile phone I got cost me £2,000, and it was crap. Every time I bought a new phone, it's got cheaper and cheaper and better and better. Our houses over the last 20 years have actually gone more and more expensive, and in my view, no better. The way to change that and fundamentally change that is through industrial process and modular construction. So we bought our own modular factory, and we're building at the moment hundreds, but we want to build thousands of homes to make great designed homes affordable to as many people as possible. And the final thing is partnership working. To make any of this work, we need to sit down with everybody. And by partnership, I mean the local authorities, I mean national government, I mean the local community, I mean the contractors, the builders. Everyone's got to sit around the table. Everyone's got their own particular desires and needs, and rightfully, but actually coming out of that with a beautiful place can mean everybody can succeed. And what I think is the most important thing is that so many of these conferences, all people talk about is value for money and delivery numbers. What we are trying to build is people's homes. The quality of those homes we build affects their life chances and their kids' life chances. And what I'd plea for is the citizens in ancient Athens, when they became a citizen, had to swear this oath. We will leave this city, not less, but better, greater, and more beautiful than we found it. And I think we're all very privileged to be working in the built environment, and an oath like that of actually building homes and building really well-designed, beautiful homes is something we should all be concentrating on.
Tom, thank you. That very stirring start. Marvin, how are you going to leave Bristol a more beautiful place than you found it?
Plant a few gardens, build some houses.
What are the challenges that you face in terms of, the plans that you have for the city?
Well, the big backdrop challenge is austerity. I mean, when we have our council meetings, people campaign and they get petitions on about frontline delivery. But what they often miss is that we lose backroom staff as well. The planners, the lawyers, those people who don't have very, jobs that appeal to people as being worthwhile, but are absolutely essential to unlocking the wheels of the place. But it strikes me as when we talk about gentrification, this is something I've been concerned about it for a long, long time. I actually lived in Columbia Heights in the late 1990s in Washington, D.C. That area is totally transformed now, and you've seen people swept out. We really need to be clear, come to kind of a shared definition of what we're actually talking about, because I do think it lands differently. And I talked to Richard Lees about this a couple of years ago. He didn't have an issue, but in Bristol it is a massive issue because we have communities being swept out. And one of the points I was making to a developer who was trying to get a scheme through with no affordable homes is that that's not a neutral act. The moment you begin to transform a community, it costs us money. You destabilize a community. People don't feel as safe. You undermine people's access to local schools because they have to move. When you fragment communities, you get poorer health outcomes. We pick up the tab for that. So a failure to deliver the balanced communities, the inclusive balanced communities that we drive for is absolutely essential. So let's define the term, but let's not just talk about being against something. Let's talk about what we're actually trying to achieve as well. And with my housing lead there, Paul's just in the third row, we've been setting out from the very beginning. We're not just building homes, we're building communities with all the wider benefits that has for the city.
Okay. Sinead, I'm sure you want to kind of follow on from some of that to talk about what you're doing on the Great Places Commission and the difference in different places.
Yeah, I mean, I think some places would love a bit of gentrification if they could get it, and I don't mean that in any sort of a negative sense, but ultimately there are places where we build a house that costs 120, 130 grand, and when we've finished it's worth 80. So the concept that, as with Theresa May's speech this morning, which I think was really powerful, and it's a really, really important moment for the sector, but actually, London-based examples again, either side of the Thames. Well, does someone in Stoke understand what that means to them when the average property price in Stoke is 120 grand? And that's the average. This isn't a social housing home. This is the average property price against a national average of 290,000. So when we talk about regeneration and gentrification, there's a really complex set of issues, and I again really absolutely support what Tom said, that and that it's a moral duty for us as housing associations to create fantastic places in communities that some people wouldn't even touch. Because actually, if we don't have the hope for those communities, who will? And so for me, there's a debate really to be had about how the government can support regenerating communities that have been left behind and forgotten. And more money, great, but where's that going? It probably ain't going to Stoke or Bolton or Middlesbrough. So I'd quite like to see more of a debate on that.
Okay, and we'll come back to that in just a minute, but I just want to hear from Hugh. I mean, you're working in a London borough there with London prices. How are you going to make 2,500 more homes? Who will they be for?
Well, I think the Bexley Council have taken a decision to be interventionist by creating Bexley Grow, so we can be a disruptor in the local marketplace about creating a standard and quality of housing which is probably arguably different, better than what's currently provided. But for me, there's part of that is linking it to placemaking, connectivity, employment. It's a holistic view. You can't just build housing in itself. Building houses is easy. And building the right houses in the right location and making sure you have sustainable communities which have good communications, good social infrastructure, that's the challenge. So for me, the challenge for Bexley Co is to do just that, so that we bring forward schemes that are not just about, well, we're just going to put some there, we're going to put some there. That's easy. It's about how you integrate that into the fabric of the existing communities. And you know, picking up the point of gentrification, if you present something, a better offering, an improvement in the local amenities, placemaking, that will inevitably have a trickle effect, a positive trickle effect on the local community. And over time, the rest of the community will improve, where people will become interested, involved in their own environments, their own properties, and standards, quality will start to rise. So you're acting as a catalyst for growth, regeneration, gentrification, if you want to call it that. But for me, the challenge for Bexley Co is to be a leader in the borough, to make a clear statement saying this is what good looks like.
Okay, Tom talked about partnerships. Who is it that you have to work with in order to actually achieve that?
Well, stating the obvious, and I think Lord Heseltine made the point, if you are going to introduce housing, whether it's social housing, affordable housing, or just housing per se, you have to bring local communities with you. That's key number one. There are other local partners in each borough, in each area, housing providers, developers, contractors. All those are partners that you need to collaborate, work with if you're going to have a successful outcome. It's easy for me to say, yes, I can build quality homes, but the challenge is finding the right company, the right organisations that will actually help me deliver that qualitative output. So for me, having a series of collaborative partnering type approaches with all these key sectors is an essential part of the jigsaw to allow Bexley Co to deliver that output.
Tom, you've been doing this a long time. How easy, how hard, what are the real challenges in terms of actually creating that, especially given, as Marvin says, the kind of backdrops of really severe spending cuts, of austerity, of cuts to local authorities? How hard has that been for you when you've been working on it?
I mean, it's like Lord Heseltine said before, it's not easy, is it? If it was easy, everybody would be doing it.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
The badge here says it'll never work, and it's our 25th year. We've got an exhibition just opened at Reba called It'll Never Work, because almost everything we've done, people have said it'll never work. But actually, my experience of life, if you start with great ideas about the vision you want to create, then you'll end up with something really worthwhile, and you have some fun along the way delivering it. And so for us, we work with all sorts of partners. We've got a big joint venture with Places for People. We work with Great Places. We work with Riverside. We work with Astor. We work with a number of house associations. We work with a local authority. We work with Homes England. We work with the local communities. But we also work with all sorts of other theatre groups, artist studios. We have a commercial workspace. So you need to have a whole series of different people. You need to share vision. And that vision is about making really great places.
Absolutely.
And coming back to this gentrification or regeneration, my experience of life is where you get ghettos, which are solely very poor people, they're not a great place to live. Equally, where you've got ghettos of very rich people in gated communities, no one talks to each other, not a great place to live. Where you've got mixed communities, schools with mixed kids in there from different communities, they're actually really exciting, really interesting places to live. And I think if you start with that as the aim, and trying to think about the placemaking, think about the schools, think about the parks, think about the nature of the streets, think about the spaces outside the houses as well as the houses themselves, you'll end up with somewhere very, very special that everybody will want to come and stay and live in.
Sinead, you've been working on all of that, haven't you, in terms of the great places. What have you found the most inspiring places that you've been to look at so far, and projects?
We're actually visiting Midlands and the North, so we've been to a number of different communities, and I think that regardless of picking one, I think what's come out really strongly is where the community is sort of self-started, and it's often because everyone else has walked away, so perhaps there isn't funding, or there hasn't been the strategy, or there hasn't been the kind of clear sort of routes to developing a vision for an area, but actually that area has been under duress, it's been challenged, and the lives people lived in those communities have been pretty poor. And it's when people have self-started, have brought themselves together and created something really exciting, and we saw some great examples of that in Liverpool, and the Eldonian community, for instance. And it's really, I think the thing that kind of is striking us more than anything is places are made by people. And that sounds a bit cheesy, but it's true. And that if we forget that, while we're putting the science around the design, actually we might as well not do anything.
So far so positive, and we've all got an awful lot of consensus so far, but there clearly are challenges. People have been moved out of estates and have felt extremely, bad about it. How do you handle that? Marvin, how do you
Well, I just want to say, this is a really important point there, because for me, if we're trying to come to a shared understanding of what gentrification actually is, because I think we could end up talking past each other, and it would mean different things in different contexts. That point about power and people taking control is essential, because ultimately I wrote an article a couple of years ago for New Start magazine, and I said, when it's a problem is if people have been swept aside. If people are choosing where to live, if everyone's got that power, that status, that economic, that political platform, then that's their decision. But actually what we're seeing is people actually being swept out. So a neighbour 2 doors down from me, well actually my next door neighbour as well, mother, child, landlord says I can get an additional £400 a month in rent, and she moves. Child has to move school. They have to move out the whole area with their social network. Someone across the road, this has happened to just 4 weeks ago. I helped them move house because the rents are going up. That's not choice, and that's a community in churn. So the powers. I mean, in Bristol, our commitment has been we've got a flagship commitment to be building 2,000 homes a year by 2020. At least 800 of those affordable. We're looking at mixed tenures as well. And again, we'll do so much. We've just launched our housing company, a Bristol housing company, but also making space for other people to get things done. So self-builds, really an award-winning scheme just went up in Dudman, actually, with United Housing, Bristol and Bath Regional Capital, 7 different tenures in that scheme. So you're going to create the conditions for a genuine mixed balanced community. So when you use the term interventionist, that's what we have to be, interventionists, but creating the conditions in which a wider range of people can get things done in place.
And why do you think gentrification does have such a bad name? I know, it clearly does.
Because it speaks to people's powerlessness and insignificance.
Yes.
Like, you don't matter. So I grew up in Eastern St. Paul's, right? When I was growing up there, I remember someone dropping me off and saying around the corner from my house, "Ooh, are you going to be okay?" I said, "I live here, it's fine." So people didn't want to come there, and all of a sudden it becomes fashionable. So put on a very personal thing, not too long ago, a headline came out saying St. Paul's was the coolest place to live in England. Now, I was actually a bit annoyed about that, and I know a number of people were too, because it wasn't too long ago that was a really negative term. People didn't want to go there. But it almost becomes like these kind of diverse poor areas become playthings. They're fashionables, they're fashion accessories. I can live with a bit of grit, I can live with a bit of diversity. And that feeds into I sense, I may be wrong, but that feeds into those sense of those people that have been there a long time. Okay, now we're fashionable, you want to come and live next door to me, but it won't be long before I'm actually swept out because I am fashionable.
Absolutely, and isn't there a real worry about the fact that prices are all going to, you won't be able to get a cup of tea and a bacon butty. It will all be about, £5 lattes. Is that what it's about?
I mean, I think there's a real issue here, and I think as a country, we've got a real issue of a wide and wide divide between rich and poor.
Yeah, exactly.
The real irony with all this is as the rents go up, who picks up the tab ultimately? It's estates through there. And so it's what a waste of money putting people in really crappy accommodation with crappy landlords. And actually, we can build an amazing 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom modular house for way less than 200 grand all in. That costs £100 a week with government finance. So for £100 a week, you can provide something on a break-even level with a fantastic brand new house, which are selling for hundreds of thousands of pounds, even in relatively poor areas. And actually, we've just got to sort out the land values, sort out the government intervention, sort out proper working, and local authorities are the natural owners. They've got access to cheap money, they've got access to land, they've got influence over the planning process, and they need long-term RPI-linked income. And actually working in partnership with private developers, with housing associations, local authorities, and leaving that in the ownership of the public sector where they can control rents on the long term and keep them linked to inflation is a win-win-win situation.
Fantastic.
Can I just, sorry, I don't do this again, but also the costs. The costs of failing don't just sit within housing and benefits. They turn up in the National Health Service. Well, I went to see Simon Stevens not too long ago, and he's saying, well, what's your flagship policy? I said, we're about building houses. And then the conversation for the next 20 minutes was about quality homes that will reduce the burden on the future of the health service. Well, this conversation around National Health Service needs to get into a public health, and good quality homes is one of the best public health interventions we can make, save us millions. Education system, future-proofing our workforce, public safety, all those things we talked about.
The drive to keep down costs. We are now developing, on many places, homes for the third time in people's lifetime. And that is an absolute waste of money. The way to make money is to make really good quality homes and let them last for hundreds of years, like our old Georgian and Victorian stock. If you do that, that is money well spent, not redeveloping things every 20 years.
Good point. Sinead, do you want to do?
Yeah, I think I wanted to kind of, I felt as I was listening to the debate that I felt that I wanted to talk about tenants and residents and the lives they lead, and the work that we all do as housing associations, local authorities and other partners and charities in our communities every day with tenants, with residents. And it just feels to me that actually this sense that following the rent cuts in 2015, housing associations had to make some really, really difficult decisions. And so we've made these difficult decisions, we've come out the other end. I think in many respects, very efficient organisations. When you look at gross margins have doubled in our organisation. We've got, really, I suppose, impressive cost per unit. But actually, did we go too far? And so the quality of the service, the core service, what we're here for is to deliver a damn good housing offer, which is beyond just building great homes. It's actually the services we deliver that wrap around some of our communities. So for us, it's employment and skills. We actually own an Ofsted regulated college within our housing association that is profitable and actually supports young people and adults into work. Now, we mustn't forget that as part of the mix. I know we don't, but I've just felt like I needed to get that in.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And whilst we're talking about getting things in, I did forget to say that we are using this excellent Slido scheme. So apparently on here, I can...
6:10 in the morning.
Apparently it's 6:10 in the morning. I can't see any questions yet, but somebody will come up to show me how to do it. So if you want to ask a question, or you could just ask a question and we can listen to it. Yeah, we've got a question. Would you like to say who you are and where it's from? Thank you. Super. Sorry.
I'd just like to pick up actually where Tom Bloxham began, which
You've got a mic
sorry,
now.
I'd just like to pick up where Tom Bloxham began, and that's about the north-south divide and how far the two get confused. Gentrification is a real issue in London, very selectively in parts of the north. There was a programme back in prehistoric times called Housing Market Renewal, which did attempt to improve the more unromantic parts of the north, the Dearne Valley, the Lancashire towns, parts of Hull, Stoke, and that got completely trashed, and it got trashed for reasons that apparently the places were being gentrified and people were being displaced, which was a travesty. The issue, though, remains that did die a death, and how you're going to win back support for a programme of that kind, which will actually start to talk about regeneration and not fret too much about how far Goldthorpe in South Yorkshire is going to be gentrified, because the property there is in a desperate condition.
Sinead.
Yeah, Ian, I absolutely agree. And I think that it's really interesting to get the debate going, because actually if you are in an area that you've seen how gentrification has had such a damaging, sort of impact on communities, and then you hear the northerners saying it's grim up north, it's life beyond the wall and all that. It's such a divide in terms of what the reality is. We've taken ministers around some of our communities and some of our sites and estates. We've got tracts of land that is just unbuildable because there's no market for it. It's actually doesn't actually, the costs of remediation, demolition, actually buying back some of the properties there. We really need the funding in place, and there's no sense that that's coming. So those of you who are on this southern end of this particular spectrum and see the challenges of gentrification, please don't think the northerners are always whinging, but there is a huge gap, and it does need to be. It's the economy stupid all day long, but we just need to look at funding for regeneration to bring back these communities.
We've got another question here which actually kind of speaks to this. Is Kim D'Souza here? Is she? Yeah, Kim. Sorry, Sim. Yeah.
Don't worry, I've been used to it for all the 60 years of my life, so I won't take it. Which one was it?
It was the one about regeneration should be about engaging with the community, and what can we... Sorry, I'll just read the question, shall I? And what can we learn about what's causing regeneration to be classed as gentrification, which I think followed on really nicely from what Sinead was saying. So thank you for asking that question. I'm sorry I asked it on your behalf. So where does regeneration, shade over into gentrification? How can we stop that happening? How can we engage with the community so that doesn't happen, Marvin?
Well, I mean, there are specific... So how it maps into Bristol, for example, because I think we do talk about the north-south divide, and it's important to recognise, but that inequality is mapped within my city. So we've got 25% of kids living in poverty in Bristol, one of the wealthiest cities outside London.
Yeah.
In Bristol West, it's got amongst the highest numbers of young people that go into higher education. In Bristol South, it's among the lowest. It's the inequality, and then so making things happen within that city context as well is important. I mean, if you've got a scheme going up in Hartcliffe, haven't you, on the lakeside, you've got a piece of, so you'll know that estate just left behind. Six areas in the city in the top 1% most deprived in England, in a city of so much wealth, and the presence of that inequality is a real challenge. But at the same time, our land prices are being pushed up, right? Which is a major challenge to getting things done when we end up at that point, which we have tried to get away from, where we don't want to end up at the end of a process where we're negotiating over viability of a share of affordable. We're trying to get in early doors so that we can talk to people about how we make sure that what we come out with is what everyone needs. A business makes some money because they have to, and we get our affordable homes, which are absolutely essential, and we get the tenure mixes if we can as well within there as well. So we've been very intentional. I mean, engaging citizens in that is part of a broader piece of work we do anyway. I don't think you could do it in isolation if you're not doing it generally. So we've voter registration programs we've done, encouraging people to come forward to get elected, to join the magistracy. There's a wider piece of work going on in the city about how we get people involved in public life. And part of that's, to be honest, a bit of an extension of my own story. I'm only mayor because I got involved with Operation Black Vote, trying to get more black and Asian people involved in politics. And we've kept those principles alive.
Tom, you wanted to...
So, I mean, probably the best example for us is the old Cardroom estate in East Manchester, which was one of the, East Manchester's a tough area. This was the toughest estate there. It was 1970s Rayburn cul-de-sac layout. Half the houses were abandoned and boarded up, although it was only 400 metres from Manchester city centre. And most people who could voted with their feet and left. But what we found is the residents who were left were actually very resilient. And they really wanted to be there, and they really wanted to be with their community, and they'd been left behind by the local authority. And actually, when we started speaking to them, they were really sceptical anything would happen. And we came to them saying, actually, we will swap your house with a brand new urban splash, a smart, trendy apartment. Thinking they'd all be saying, oh, amazing, thank you, Mr. Bloxham's great. None of them wanted an urban splash flat, yeah? And they all wanted a house, yeah, where they could park their car in front of the house because we're afraid of it going missing. And this was a place where joyriders were happening, and virtually 100% of people on benefits, most of it third generation unemployment. But actually, gradually over time, we got together with them, we realised what they wanted, we got them to pick their own architects to design their own houses, some quite amazing, brilliantly designed houses. We made a one-move policy, so we actually moved them in 3 different phases. So we built some new houses first, moved the first people in there, cleared their houses, moved the second people in there, and actually the community stayed together and became really resilient. And what we also brought in is where there were 120 homes, half of them abandoned, there are going to be 1,400 homes. But each of those people already there is still there with their families on the same terms, transferred from Manchester City Council to a housing association, Great Places. And I think that's sort of one of the best examples. And I remember very clearly speaking to one of the residents, and I've spoken to this guy a couple of times, said, what's happening? Nothing. He said, oh, things are getting better. And I said, why are things getting better? And he said, well, we've always had these joyriders coming around. And he said, last night, me and a few other dads told the joyrider to go and F off back to his own area, and they never came back. And it was actually these residents taking up control themselves and seeing a positive future.
Yeah. Is Luke Barrett here? Yes, Luke, do you want to ask your question? You had a question specifically for Marvin, didn't you?
Yeah, hi, Luke Barrett from Inside Housing. I was just wondering, Marvin, do you agree with Mayor of London City Khan's policy on estate regeneration ballots, and would you like to see them introduced in Bristol?
Sorry, you have to tell me.
Estate regeneration ballots, like Sadiq Khan's proposed for here in London, that when estates are going to be regenerated, there has to be a ballot of the residents. Do you want that?
Yeah, to be honest, I'd have to go and read much more about it. I think there'd be a danger of. I'm a bit wary of referendum-based kind of, if that's it, kind of approaches. I've just made a big decision in Bristol around not going ahead with an arena in the city centre. If it was down to a public vote because of the way the newspapers were reporting it and so forth, we'd have gone ahead with it and taken on nearly £50 million of debt and made a financial disaster for Bristol. So I suppose maybe we're on a smaller base in the city, so I'm not saying what he's done isn't right, but in my city, my hope is that what we can do is enter into a kind of a collection of trusting relationships, if I can say that, now I'm officially a politician, and talk with people, engage the community and come up with a decision together. I'll be wary about people saying no when we think actually something does need to happen and change needs to happen. So.
It's a good question though. Hugh, in Bexley, how will you go about things there in terms of creating the kind of trusting partnerships that Marvin's spoken about?
I think for me, one, clearly has to be a clear engagement with local communities and local representatives, but you have to be clear about what the proposition is, the vision of what you're proposing, what you're selling, as an alternative to what's there at the moment. So if you want people to buy into, some people aspire to having their own homes and other people are happy staying in apartments, so there'll be a mixed economy in terms of the solution you need to come with, and each location site that we're looking at will have different tenure, will have different design mix, different housing sort of mix and densities, and that's all to the good because that provides diversification in an area and in the borough. It provides a platform for everybody to participate, whether it's newlyweds to the older generation, so they can get on the housing ladder. The simple truth is that a lot of people, a lot of youngsters are saying, how am I going to afford to get onto the housing ladder? So that's part of the dynamic of what you're offering. So engagement, having a consultation. But again, I'm nervous about having an absolute referendum coming from residents because holistically you have to look at the bigger picture, and sometimes residents don't necessarily do that.
Okay, fine. Tom, what do you think of that?
I think it's all about the vision. When we started Urban Splash 25 years ago, 200, 300 people lived in Manchester city centre, and they asked the house builders, why aren't you building the city centre? And they said, well, we'll build anywhere, we'll build what people want. And they spent millions on market research, and everybody pointed to the same house they always used to. And it's like, the world market for computers was going to be 2 or 3, wasn't it? The Sony Walkman was never going to work. And so actually, yes, there's something about consultation, asking people, but I think you've got to have the conversation in a fairly sophisticated way.
Yeah.
As we saw with the Brexit votes, be careful what you wish for, and be careful how arguments are presented. For me, it's about leadership. For me, it's about coming up with a vision, coming up, articulating the sort of place you want to build, the sort of place you want to live in, and actually building a people and support around that vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
A completely different question from somebody in the audience, which is interesting. How much should local private sector businesses be involved in regeneration? So not the developers, but the local businesses. Sinead, how have you found that in terms of working on the commission? How has that been?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of great examples really of all types of social enterprises involved, as well as private businesses. And I think in terms of our experience within North Staffordshire, we've been able to grow our network of businesses that will take young people as apprentices, and that's been fantastic. So we started off with something like 70 businesses we had connections with, and over the last sort of 10 years, that's now something like 1,400 businesses, or SMEs. So the area is characterised by SMEs because of the withdrawal of heavy industry, mines, steel, pottery. And a lot of these businesses can't support an apprentice, so our training company makes profits. It goes through our charity, and our charity supports businesses to take apprentices. That's just one way when we're going back to the economy and helping people into work and breaking the cycle of worklessness.
I want businesses to be involved in every aspect of leadership in the city, not because they're going to ravenously make profit from it, but this is the context in which they do business. They need to be responsible. So we've developed something in Bristol called the City Office, a kind of a one city approach. And so every 6 months, we pull together chief execs, directors from the whole city. The first one, we had about 75 turn up. And the collective spend in the room was about £6 billion. Between us, we employed about 70,000 people. And my point to them was, if we all collectively wanted to have an impact on the city, we could do it in this room. The last one, we had 140 turn up. And the idea is that in a place, if you want to get stuff done, you're much more likely to get it done if you all understand what you want to get done and you're pointing in the same direction, rather than a thousand different directions. So I want business to be talking to their health service about mental health, because that's their future workforce, about physical health, about education outcomes, but not just making demands of the public sector, saying how can we come and support you to get that done too, with reading support, supporting public health programs and housing and so forth.
Absolutely. Tom, thank you.
I mean, totally. I mean, Urban Splash got about 1 million square feet of commercial space, mostly designers, creative industries, and flexible space. But if you take somewhere like the Northern Quarter in Manchester, that many of you have heard of, it's quite a cool place where lots of people live now. The Northern Quarter in Manchester used to be the crappy part of Manchester behind Market Street that no one lived in. And actually it was about coming up with a vision about being a great place to live, but also a place for artists, a place for independent retailers, a place for coffee shops, a place for art galleries, and actually the actual mix of use that makes places rich, that makes places desirable, that brings people to want to live in different communities.
For me, it's important because I think it's part of the proposition of placemaking in sustainable communities. So having strong businesses in an environment is key, and their interests will be self-centered in the context of, if I want to expand, where do I get my staff from, are they skilled, where they're going to live, what's the connectivity benefits. All those are parts of the jigsaw. So getting their input about what they want to see happening, and Bexley can be a facilitated deliverer of some of those changes, both not just in terms of housing, but infrastructure, to unlock some of the wider regeneration and wider benefits that the private sector can bring to the table at the same time.
We've got loads of questions. Thank you ever so much. We won't be able to get through them all, but I'm just going to amalgamate two because they're really interesting. One is, how do you measure the success of a regeneration project? But the second question is really good. Lots of talk here among yourselves about engaging communities in regeneration. Now we spend most of our time glued to our phones. Do we need to think differently about this? So, that's a really good question. How do you actually get people, out on the streets, or not even on the streets, but how do you get people involved, and how do you measure when you've done a good scheme? Tom?
Well, I'm going to use the same answer to both those questions, actually, because you make really great places to live, and you judge that by places you'd want to live. And everywhere we do an Urban Splash, the question is, would I want to live there? Would I want to work there? If they're great places to live, it's not just about being inside the house, it's about being outside. It's having great high streets, having independent retailers, having green space, having parks. And why we're all together, why cities have survived since the times of ancient Athens, is because people like meeting each other. You like those random meetings. Why are we all here today to some random meeting? Why do we go out on the high street? You get places where people can bump into their neighbours and meet people and enjoy life and enjoy their life.
And they still want to do that even though they're, on their phones all the time?
We're all here, aren't we?
Well, we're all here.
We're all here.
Hugh, how do we measure?
If one was being simplistic, the easy measure is count the number of closed shops on the high street now, and in 10 years' time, how many of those have been reopened because of regeneration and footfall on people. So that's one measure of success.
Okay. Sinead, how do we measure success in a changing connectivity world? Is a different way of putting that question.
Well, yeah, I'm just thinking of an example where we have worked tirelessly on an area which is in the top 2% most deprived in the country. And we have invested millions, some of which was market renewal money, the rest of it was our own. Every scheme we look at doesn't pay back. It's a big black hole, breaks the model. FD is ageing rapidly. Every time we bring a new scheme, we're sitting there and trying not to catch his eye. But actually, you know, I think it is self-evident when you drive around those communities, when you walk through those communities. Some of the data, because of austerity, is telling us that community hasn't moved. It's still top 2%. In fact, in health terms, it's zero. It's top zero. It's the worst in the country. And this is where we've put millions of pounds, and it's a place that is great to look at, that it works. But actually, there are other factors that I think Marvin talked about as well earlier. That is austerity biting. What we see now is only going to get worse. The economy isn't even across the country. People haven't got, you know, quality jobs. The values are still low. But so what do we mean by success? Would that be walk away from that community and not invest those millions and let it carry on and degenerate? Or does it mean actually when we go there, people are living quality lives and enjoying that, you know, that place? So I don't think it's a measurable thing in the pure sense of counting. Personally, it's a sense, it's a feeling.
Marvin, is it measurable or is it? You
Well, I'll take the first one. What I did there.
It's a great place.
Fantastic measure. And I think it's wickedly challenging. I mean, we're actually trying to come up with a set of city metrics right now to get rid of what I call a chaos of metrics, about 1,500 sort of different measures that are live across us, health, criminal justice, and we're trying to come up with a set of city measures that align themselves to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. But so I'll be able to come back with a better answer next year. But I would like to look on those measures of integration, those measures around social mobility, mental health, people's sense of safety on the streets, education, attainment, all those things that I think housing actually sits at the centre of. I mean, I'd like just to reframe the whole conversation around housing, that it is the intervention, right? It's not just a unit that we give someone a front door that they can go and shut themselves behind. It's about building, well, as you've been saying, it's about building a place that will make tens of millions of pounds of savings across the rest of the city or the hundreds of millions across the city.
And just in very practical terms, just as we come to the end of the session, what can you, as a local authority, what can local authorities do to actually maximise that community well-being? You know that you care so passionately about. What powers do you actually have right now?
Well, that's the point of tension, because we would like greater financial powers, greater financial independence, capturing the value of land, and obviously we want more power in those negotiations, when we get to those viability assessments as well. But I think what we've done, I think the single most important thing we did in Bristol, and I think we have, the feedback I get is that people perceive us differently from places that didn't get stuff done to starting getting things done, was to make a very open and bold political commitment and say we'll hang our political reputations on our commitment to getting houses built. And here's my political lead. This is someone, if you have an issue, you go and talk to them. And their sole job is to get houses built, but the right kinds of houses. And I think that meant that once we got a bit of a ball of momentum coming, people have got more confidence. And I stood on, just 2 days ago, I was stood on a site that when it came forward, had 0% affordable houses out of 346. Now it's 100 affordable homes. The developers are happy, Sovereign's happy, we're happy, and it kind of hopefully it gives a sense of hope in the city that we can get stuff done and it can be world class, and we can offer homes to people in the city. But that political commitment, I think, was the single most significant thing we did.
Absolutely. Well, I'm very sorry. I think we have come to the end of the time. I know there were still more questions, and I'm sure that we could talk a lot more about this. But for now, thank you very much indeed to our fantastic panel. Thank you. Thanks very much.